So, hi, I'm Mandy Rose, Professor of Documentary and Digital Cultures at UWE Bristol. And on behalf of the Digital Cultures Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you to this publication event to mark the launch of Tom Livingstone's brilliant monograph, Hybrid Images and the Vanishing Point of Digital Media Effects. So, Dr. Tom Livingstone is a research fellow working here at UWE Bristol on the UKRI's My World programme with me, and I'll say it's a great pleasure to be working with Tom. It's really a treat. So he's focusing on cutting-edge R&D, taking place within a range of creative productions, from VR biography to stop-motion animation. Tom was the recipient of a British Academy Talent Development Award last year to pilot the use of game engines for producing academic outputs. And a piece of that playable criticism was exhibited this summer at the British Academy Summer Showcase. So Tom has published widely, and Hybrid Images is his first monograph arising from his PhD research. Tom is being joined this evening by Dr. Nick Jones. Nick is a senior lecturer in film, television, and digital culture at the University of York. He's the author of Hollywood Action, Films and Spatial Theory, of Spaces, Mapped and Monstrous, Digital 3D Cinema and Visual Culture, and most recently, GUI Media, Screen Entertainment and the Graphic User Interface. That came out in 2023. This was nominated for Best Monograph by the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies. So Nick's published widely in a range of journals and edited collections. So what's going to happen this evening is that Tom's going to kick off talking for about 20 minutes on the main themes of the book and on how his arguments might stand up in the face of the accelerating rate of media change that we're looking at. Nick will follow up with some thoughts and provocations, and Tom will respond to those. We hope at that point that we'll have about 15 minutes left, and we're really keen to hear your questions. So please, can you add these to the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen? And we'll come to those questions after Nick and Tom have been in conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Tom, but not before I've read you the brilliant endorsement for the book that Professor Sean Cubitt has written, which I just love. He says, the contemporary literally comprises of multiple, simultaneous, often incompatible times and spaces. Tom Livingstone's guide to the new visual effects is as fast and furious as the moving image, social and screen aesthetics that help us inhabit this increasingly alien world. So I'm looking forward to hearing Tom talking more about the book. So over to you, and congratulations on the publication.
Thank you very, very much, Mandy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone for taking time out of their evening to be here on this cold winter evening. And thanks in advance to Nick for your catastrophic takedown of my work. So my ambition for this evening is to sort of introduce you to some of the personal and intellectual sort of contexts for the book before so running through essentially some of the intellectual frameworks that I sort of employ to look at hybrid images. I'll then talk about a few of the chapters individually, just to sort of give you a sense of how my methodology applies to the image cultures that we live within. And ultimately, the sort of ambition for that is to throw forward to the sort of a future horizon for this theoretical sort of tangling with hybrid images as they become increasingly inaccessible to critique. So obviously the book is called The Vanishing Point of Digital Visual Effects, and I'd really be keen on just opening up an exploration for thinking about how to tackle our increasingly sort of are increasingly sort of difficult to apprehend image culture as it passes various sort of vanishing points and becomes sort of inaccessible to critique. But going back to the sort of the historical context, the book is the culmination of a academic research project that kicked off in about 2016, but it has a sort of longer personal context. So if I can just get the slides running. Always fun when you can't fix your first slide. There we go. A wider personal context. My family had a Laserdisc, which is a precursor to to DVDs and Blu-rays. Only the discs are about the size of a sort of 12-inch vinyl. But the only Laserdisc we actually had was a copy of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Robert Zemeckis' 1988 film, which was obviously famed for its hybridization of live action and animation techniques. Now, one of the fantastic sort of affordances of the Laserdisc, especially in comparison to VHS technology that was live at the time, is that when you pause the frame of a Laserdisc, there's none of that sort of frenetic VHS judder. And so as a very young child, I think I spent quite a long time sort of going back and forth between these frames of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, just becoming incredibly interested in how sort of these sort of structures of credulity were built within individual frames, such that we could look at an image which combined obviously photographic content with obviously unreal animated content, but nevertheless engage with it as a sort of diegetic whole. Of course, at that time, I didn't know words like diegetic, but also neither was my interest in hybrid images particularly original, because the visual context of the 90s, well, the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s was one which was absolutely dominated by hybrid images. Hybrid images were absolutely everywhere. They were characteristic of mainstream filmmaking. And of course, I just point out that I worked very, very hard to get the to get the EUP to feature an image from Jurassic Park on the cover of the book. That was, again, I'm one of those sort of like academics who's managed to turn a sort of avid passion for a 90s film into what I now describe it as a sort of core text for my research. Anyway, so my interest was in how the sort of like how that hybridity was managed, and in texts like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it was relatively simple. And as soon as I started, investigating this technique in full in an academic context, I was quickly alerted to the fact that hybrid images have a deep historical, have a deep history as well. And in fact, sort of hybridization techniques are almost as old as cinema itself. But I was less interested in the history of the hybrid image techniques, but more interested in how those techniques were becoming increasingly sophisticated. And so the questions that arose for me were, what will hybrid images look like in the next generation of hybrid images look like? And more than that, what sort of world will an image culture that is characterized by seamless hybridity within our sort of films and television, what world will that manifest? And so looking forward from the perspective of 1988, we still have lots of angry rabbits in our films, but the sophistication of the hybridity has increased tenfold. So this is not one of my core texts, but nevertheless, this is a still from Peter Rabbit 2, I believe. And the point of showing this image is to sort of point out that the hybridity on display here is vastly more sophisticated. That's not to say that the Zemeckis film is unsophisticated. It was way ahead of its time and has many sort of digital elements, but that's a conversation for a different time. What I'm trying to point out with this is still from Peter Rabbit is that the hybridity, the legibility of the techniques that hybridize the animated portion and the photographic portion is increasingly invisible as these techniques get more sophisticated. What's more, there's also a sort of interdependence between the live action elements and the animated elements that isn't on display in earlier examples. So, for example, Donald Gleason had to the live action capture of him being punched in the face is performed in anticipation of post photographic manipulation. And so I found these ideas very, very interesting. These techniques becoming increasingly sort of sophisticated, increasingly niche, increasingly sort of hard to grasp. But at the same time, what's going on in this picture is all those sophisticated techniques are working together to consolidate what is essentially a photographic attitude to the image itself. As in, despite the fact that the animation taking place within this still is much more sort of complex than the animation and the sort of characterization and so on and so forth of Roger Rabbit, all those technologies are being combined to elicit a relationship between spectator and image that is predicated on a photographic presumption, such that we look at this image as if it were a photograph. And that's something that's not quite present in the hybridity of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And it was this solicitation of a photographic epistemology that that sort of primed me to sort of articulate an intellectual context to grasp hybridity in the round. And that intellectual context is media epistemology. So large hyphen and large word alert there. Media epistemology. Essentially, there's many media epistemologists to choose from. Friedrich Kittler is many other people's choice. And Friedrich Kittler famously started a book with the quote, media determine our situation. But my question always was, how? What are the sort of practical aspects of that determination and how can we pick them apart? So my particular media epistemologist of choice is Wilhelm Flusser, who's one of his sort of grounding contentions is that humanity co-creates the world around us and our experience of that world with the media that relate it and in some cases screen it. So for example, a provocation that precedes his work on photography is that the concept of history, understood as one thing happening after the other, a sort of cause and effect unraveling of time, is not possible without the media technology of alphanumeric linear writing. Because linear writing proceeds in a sort of a linear process that is analogous to our growing understanding of history, but that understanding of history is grounded in the media that makes it possible. So going forward, he then sort of the second sort of great revolution in media technology and social understandings of reality that he proposed was the invention of the camera, which the real revolution in the invention of the camera is this was a media technology that operated in a means that we didn't have to learn a language or in order to decode the thing that was being mediated. Photographs are, in Flusser's words, seemingly non-symbolic, such that we look through them as if we are looking through windows onto reality. But of course, and that sort of has a variety of sort of social and cultural contexts whose ramifications extend from the earliest invention of photography all the way through to today. For example, the idea that a photograph is evidence of something depends upon this epistemological misreading of the photograph as transparent. Nevertheless, that doesn't really help us when I'm trying to think about media epistemology and how it might sort of contain the proliferation of hybrid images that characterize the sort of historical the period of images that I was particularly interested in, which obviously correlates to my childhood and young adulthood, the Jurassic Park years. So yes, the question that I was very interested in was how can we update Flusser's concepts around the sort of transparency of photography to sort of compensate for the growing sophistication of post-photographic manipulations that occur within hybrid images. But happily within Flusser, there is a third provocation, which I found to be very sort of core to my research, specifically that he contends that the critical reception of technical images, which is another word for things like photographs and in his writing, demands a level of consciousness that corresponds to the one in which they were produced. This poses the question whether we as a society are capable of such a change of consciousness. So the argument here is that the technical sophistication of media or our critical capacity to critique images is not commensurate to the technical sophistication of media, and therefore that has social consequences and demands, and therefore sort of image culture demands a excessively technical image culture demands a corresponding social change to such that we are not, in Flusser's words, sort of robotized or made functionaries of our image culture. And so that became the sort of the accelerant in my thinking about hybrid images and where this idea of the vanishing point of digital visual effects comes from, because the vanishing point describes a process of naturalization, the point in our relationship with media, and that is photographs as well as hybrid images, as well as other sort of forms of imagery, AI generated images and so on and so forth, where the technical criteria of its creation disappear from view. And we essentially mistreat those images as if they were, like photographs, seemingly non-symbolic. Or in other words, or the technical criteria disappear from view and we can't critique them in a manner that is commensurate to the impact that they have upon us as spectators. So that's a sort of like very, very broad brush introduction to this sort of intellectual framework that I tried to wrap around this, what was and remains a growing corpus of hybrid images. And I rolled that out over 4 case studies, which I'll sort of briefly introduce you here in sort of potted chapters, and then I'll, depending on time, open up 1 or 2 of these issues in more depth. Because ultimately, this media epistemological framework demanded that I think slightly more deeply about embodied experience and relationships to image culture and what sorts of assumptions and presumptions and prerequisites of lived experience our relationship to the images that surround us enforce. So mapped almost onto the compass, I decided to look at experiences of history, experiences of space, experiences of time, and experiences of the future as they were mediated by hybrid images across all sorts of visual culture. So the Colorized Archive, as it says, looked at a specific technique of post-photographic manipulation, digital colorization, in order to ask questions about how it mediated the black and white archive, and that expands out into questions of how that mediation impacts our access to not just the black and white archive, but also our understanding of history. So that was an updating of Flusser's concept of how history is a media-dependent concept. I was curious to think about how history that has passed through the bottleneck of the colorization process is likewise media dependent, and how that media dependency inflects our understanding of the past. My second chapter, Hybrid Spaces, Digital Compositing and Holograms, took a very similar approach, but to the proliferation of hologram tropes in television and across cinema. I was watching a lot of anyway, I was watching a lot of altered. There was a Netflix program which was extremely popular at the time, which was just. Thank you, Altered Carbon. I was watching a lot of Altered Carbon at the time, and in the same way that I was interested in translating my fascination with Jurassic Park into a sort of core text. So I took this program, which had nothing but holograms, and just decided to make it a core text into an investigation of holograms, but holograms which the effect is obviously achieved by a process of digital compositing, which is a layering together of 2D images to create an unrealistic, or not unrealistic, but a sort of a non-veridical and non-pro-filmic screen space. And so the assumption was that these screen spaces built out of digital compositing techniques were becoming ubiquitous, such that we internalized that idea of that experience of space in our own lived experience, and become primed to experience space as forever saturated by sort of like latent digital channels and volumes and so on and so forth. Moving from space to time. Again, this is not, I'd like to say this is obviously not an unambitious project, but I was happy to be able to break down these larger philosophical questions into hybrid techniques. And each hybrid technique gave me a sort of avenue for thinking about these wider media epistemological questions. And in the third chapter, the hybrid temporal object, the technique that I looked at was time ramping or speed ramping, which is the sort of oscillation between fast and slow motion without any sort of break in a given duration. such that sort of like we wobble in and out of tempos as we watch what was purportedly a unbroken duration being represented on screen. Sort of the again the sort of avid fandom that I translated into academic work was the growing sort of prevalence of what are called oneers. So these long unbroken takes in action cinema. So a good example would be the skydive in Mission Impossible Fallout, but they are becoming increasingly common. And these digital oneers are obviously durations constructed out of multiple fragments, but that fragmentation disappears from view as they're brought together in these seamless durations that oscillate in and out of fast and slow motion. And so it was through that lens that I was able to think deeply about our sort of lived experience of time and how, in fact, these aesthetic trends portend a sort of growing intuitive understanding of time as sort of time within a sort of digital regime, as composed of sort of almost infinite increments underneath our lived experience of duration, that means that sort of intensify our experience of time. Then my final chapter was on computer animation and material culture. And this was very interested in looking at the phenomenon of essentially photorealistic digital assets within otherwise animated contexts. So flipping the Who Framed Roger Rabbit paradigm on its head, I was interested in looking at films from the Toy Story franchise or the Lego films, where it was clear to us as spectators that these films are animated texts. We're not supposed to be looking at we're not supposed to be engaging with the images as if they are representing real pro-filmic environments. But nevertheless, within those texts and within the sort of like the computational muscularity of the sort of rendering protocols, the degree to which computer animated texts were able to present individual items as being compellingly photorealistic. So an example would be the Rubik's Cube from WALL-E, for example, or Moana's hair, or the thumbprints that are on all the minifigures throughout the Lego films, that we engage with them as if they are part of material culture. And what sort of gave me a sort of avenue into thinking about how computer animation mediates or pre-mediates a sort of the material culture of the near future was the idea that these pipelines the computer animation shares a pipeline with many manufacturing pipelines and computer animated design and computer assisted design pipelines, such that in actual fact, when you do watch a contemporary computer animated text that uses as an audience of children, there's a strong likelihood that these the things on screen are in fact sort of essentially digital prototypes of toys that are yet to be manufactured. And so these films become sites in which sort of appetites for material culture are articulated, and so that was a sort of, and therefore they become sort of vectors for populating our material culture with this or that toy. So that's a sort of rapid overview of the project. And I think what I'll do now is I'll just run through a couple of the chapters in slightly more detail with images so that you can get a better sense of the type of texts that the book is dealing with, the type of methodologies that it's engaging with, but also to sort of introduce the problem of how to think these things through in a visual culture that is increasingly dominated by hybridity. It's not that hybridity has fully disappeared. It's almost become so sort of ubiquitous as to be meaningless. And therefore, I think it's worth sort of, again, breaking down that sort of provocation, namely that hybridity is something we don't even see anymore, into its constituent techniques to see whether or not these arguments hold sway in the visual culture of late 2024. Okay, so talking briefly about the colorized archive. So what I think I'll do is I'll talk about the colorized archive, I'll talk about holograms, and then I'll race to conclude. So the colorized archive by Cortex within this one, I was less of a fan of this one, to be fair. It wasn't a matter of translating something that I really enjoyed, but I thought the Beatles documentary was quite good when it came out. The core text in the colorized archive chapter was obviously Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old from 2018. And you can see here, this is a promotional image from the film itself, but there was a lot of sort of paratextual activity around sort of celebrating the affordances of digital compositing, digital colorization as a means of restoration. So Peter Jackson was publicly went on record in talking about the idea that adding color was actually a means of humanizing the subjects of the black and white archive and bringing these images back to life. And I was interested in critiquing this because ultimately I wasn't entirely sure that sort of filtering the black and white archive through the technical cultural sort of bottleneck of a digital colorization pipeline counted as restoration. I think it was my instinct was that it counted more as interference. And in many ways, that is the case because digital colorization requires it doesn't just operate through reference and figuring out what color that thing would be, therefore what color it should be, especially now that it is principally driven principally driven algorithmically. That work of deciding what color a given object in a frame should be is increasingly determined by a even narrower database than the black and white archive itself. And sometimes you get the colorization and the sort of semiotics involved in colorization is wrong and drives an agenda that is not restorative but semantic. So, for example, Peter Jackson's film is absolutely covered in red. And that sort of is channeling obviously it's November, but it's channeling the sort of a culture of memorialization around the First World War that it was its centenary when the film was released, the centenary of the armistice, and but channeling that culture of memorialization that had already promoted red as the color of as the sort of significant color, but the stocks of 1918 and the sort of the physical materiality of the film stock in that time was not capable of registering red as anything other than a dark black. And so the actual task of laying red, a vibrant red that Jackson required, over what would be a very dark and unforgiving and sort of low dynamic range black within the black and white archive, was one that proved technically quite challenging. And therefore, red is often rather spuriously applied across the film. And it's pursuing a sort of like an agenda that is sort of rewriting history in many ways. But also at the same time, it points us to the fact that only certain aspects of the archive are amenable to digital colorization, just as black and white images don't, black and white stocks didn't, orthochromatic stocks didn't register red particularly successfully. So the sort of spatial registrations of some of these images aren't amenable to colorization processes as well. Therefore, as the cultural expectation that history can be experienced in color grows overwhelmingly, so the archive itself becomes narrowed according to what can be colorized. And so that's where the sort of technical process of digital colorization begins to intercede with our and mediate our access to history through the archive. But it's not all doom and gloom, because I think there's also room for provocative uses of these technologies. And the chapter explores a sort of how digital colorization can be used provocatively to highlight and deconstruct precisely these processes of excessive technical mediation of the archive that I've been describing. So Raoul Peck's 2016 film, I'm Not Your Negro, has a fascinating moment in it, which goes rather under discussed in commentary around the film, where this is a scene where James Baldwin is debating William F. Buckley in the Cambridge Union, and rather completely without comment within the context of the scene, the film changes from black and white to color. And in so doing, our sort of like registration of the faces and spaces of the scene change as well. And we address the image in a slightly different manner, albeit sort of like one that goes under, it's not a particularly, it's not an it's an invitation to reflect rather than a sort of polemical intervention. But nevertheless, it's one I found very productive in thinking about how experimental uses of colorization can expose the cultural impact that it is already having in an accelerated pace. So that was the sort of outline of the colorization archive chapter, but at the same time, these things, thinking about going forward, colorization, or rather contemporary color technologies and their relationship to the sort of materiality of past media, is actually a very lively conversation today. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen the sort of Reddit reactions to the Wicked trailer, but it is being pilloried for having a muted color palette, which pays a terrible disservice to the sort of legacy of the Technicolor wonder of the original Wizard of Oz film. And I think this conversation is very interesting insofar as it reflects, again, an anxiety about how the technical criteria by which color is communicated on screen is having a sort of, it has downstream cultural impact. Because I believe, and I think perhaps I could be, someone else has more sort of technical information at hand, but Wicked is is an ICVFX production, so it's been filmed in large part within an LED volume, and also at the same time there is a tendency in contemporary filmmaking to film everything in either RAW or LOD, so capturing as much sort of visual information as possible, but not within a sort of videographical criteria, as data, the sort of datafication of color images, such that you can then give yourself a lot of chance to manipulate it afterwards, means that the sort of the material quality, the vibrancy of the original Technicolor product is something that escapes remediation. Now, I'm sure after the sort of backlash from the trailer, there'll be some consequences. There'll be some sort of like a very rapid color grading exercise being performed on Wicked. But even that speaks to the idea that our relationship with images is predicated on the disappearance of color grading as an everyday practice. The idea that almost every image we interact with in our everyday lives has had some form of color manipulation, be it algorithmic or the interference of the legible interference of an individual, has had some form of color interference, but that sort of processing, that technical mediation has disappeared from view. I will. So anyway, that's my methodology in sort of in a nutshell. The idea that I treat a technical practice of hybridity as a technical bottleneck, which has a sort of downstream consequences, not only for the the aesthetics of the images that it produces, but also our relationship to an image culture in which those techniques have become ubiquitous. So racing through the hybrid spaces and holograms chapter. Obviously, holograms, once again, had a deep history within mainstream cinema. Obviously, this is from Star Wars. But I traced with the tracing digital compositing. This is a form of, I've forgotten the word. Anyway, this is a chemical compositing process, but digital compositing enabled this sort of like the futuristic aesthetic of holograms to take on several interesting characteristics and tropes, including sort of interactivity, density of information, and sort of like saturating three-dimensional space. And it was this trope that I was particularly interested in. And it's one that sort of, again, I take to augur a cultural embrace of the technique of digital compositing, that as these images proliferate across culture and become more and more ubiquitous, we have forgotten, and that forgetting, or that sort of like treating these images as if they were transparent, or treating these images as if they were not dependent on a rigid set of technical criteria to produce the effect that they champion, that sort of the vanishing point of that that technical criteria in digital visual effects has media epistemic ramifications. I think, again, moving the conversation to its sort of a future horizon, we live in a world in which sort of spatial computing is the bringing of the sort of holographic fantasy to everyday life. But it depends again on the sort of micro management of our gaze and our relationship with physical space, such that you can world lock your sort of holographic workspaces within the Apple Vision Pro and so on and so forth. But my argument here is that, like, the fantasy of a space that is saturated by sort of digital productivity tools that Iron Man puts forward has been made manifest within the promotional materials of the Apple Vision Pro, which are also, incidentally, these obviously are the products of not particularly sophisticated digital compositing. But it demonstrates the idea that once these sort of image cultures pass a threshold, that ubiquity has downstream cultural consequences. And we are entrained to anticipate the saturation of our physical spaces by the functionality of spatial computing. You've been very patient. I'm going to race to the end. So these are the other exciting things that I would have talked about. But the conclusion, which I shall absolutely barrel through, the conclusion is that the hybrid images are something that require us to take a sort of a historical lens, because the historical lens allows us to access the granularity of the evolution of these processes, and not only the evolution of the processes, but the evolution of the media epistemological relationship with images that these processes and their evolution entail, such that obviously the image from 1993, whilst incredibly charismatic, is relatively simplistic and quite easy and to sort of our trained eyes to pick apart. Whereas the more recent image, again, involves a cluster of these effects. And whilst it is evidently a promotional still that has been sort of cobbled together, its hybridity is altogether more baffling, is altogether more immediate, and the sort of the opportunity to contemplate hybrid images has disappeared as their ubiquity grows. So what this means for our contemporary image culture that is sort of, now facing down the prospect of generative AI is that, looking forward, I would suggest that the arguments that I put forward in the book lay the ground for what is the media epistemological negotiation to come. So now that we're faced with generative AI, which is the sort of ultimate database composites, the question of whether or not it's real or not is utterly naive. And the ground from which our sort of epistemological engagement with AI image culture will stem, I'm suggesting, is one that is not photographic in nature, but hybrid in nature. And so perhaps there is a future for the argument of the book in which it essentially contextualizes our ongoing process of media epistemological negotiation with new highly technologized image cultures such as AI as they emerge. I'm sorry for waffling on. Thank you very much for your attention. There, I'll leave up that thing at the end so that if you'd like to petition your librarian to buy the book, there's also a discount available. Thank you very much.
I'll jump in and I'll say thanks, Tom. And hopefully people can hear me. And we've still got the code up on the screen, which is great. I'll keep my response relatively brief. I think Tom's done a great accounting of his project here. I think it is a fascinating set of ideas and a really exciting yeah, really exciting kind of theoretical framework, and then the way it's put forward in the book is very effective as far as I'm concerned. I think that Jurassic Park kind of came up at the beginning of and then at the end, and it's on the cover of what Tom's just been saying. And I think he opens the book with a really interesting. I should address you, shouldn't I, Tom? You open the book with a really interesting sort of comparison of yeah, the moments of VFX spectacle from Jurassic Park in 1993, and as these kind of wondrous, discrete elements versus Jurassic World Dominion, where every shot pretty much contains some kind of CGI, some kind of VFX, and the dinosaurs. You know, there's a metaphor there that we've moved from Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs are in enclosed environments, to Jurassic World, where the dinosaurs are everywhere and you can't turn a corner without bumping into them. And that's a lovely metaphor for the kind of rise in digital VFX imagery within our culture, where we've moved from this kind of segregated, oh, you know, here's the VFX shot kind of material of the maybe 80s, late 80s, early 90s, to a kind of VFX saturated present, as indexed by the Jurassic Park / Jurassic World films really nicely. Yeah, so I think the idea of a vanishing point is just so useful as a concept as it's laid out in this book, because we're not talking about invisibility. We're not talking about visual effects no longer being discernible, or the quality of them, or the necessarily the kind of literacy of the spectator, although I think that's part of it. But this idea of a vanishing point being kind of the standardization, the kind of normalization of a certain set of kind of criteria for images, which again, Tom's structure your structure kind of allows you to go through so many facets of that, in terms of temporality, in terms of material culture, and stepping beyond the screen and looking at kind of, yeah, the relationship of those digital constructs to the material physical world, to things like colorization, which I think what you say about colorization is equally applicable to ideas of 3D conversion, so stereoscopic 3D cinema conversion, which is something that I've done a lot of research on. That idea of kind of constructed space or constructed color, as opposed to there being this kind of natural or kind of perfectly captured veridical color space, whatever it might be. So yeah, the vanishing point concept speaks to our kind of media literacy and the way we navigate it today, the way we as scholars discuss it. And I think something else that I enjoyed about the book and was quite struck by was your willingness, and you've done it again in this talk, to acknowledge where your own influence comes from in terms of your kind of passion, your enthusiasm, your interest in certain forms of cinema, certain forms of TV, and how that kind of builds on your own biographical experience. So it's not a huge part of the book, but there are moments where you acknowledge the pleasure that we take from these images, these sequences, and that's okay. That doesn't make us slaves to a commodity capitalist machine which is destroying us. Yes, the commodity capitalist machine is destroying us, but within that, we can acknowledge the pleasure this kind of content gives us, and that is a productive act. That doesn't make us that doesn't somehow kind of debunk, delegitimize the things that we say as scholars, to kind of fold that in as well. So again, the fact that you're kind of acknowledging Roger Rabbit and your history with that as a genesis for this project speaks to that sort of, yeah, it's okay to acknowledge that, and you know, there is still kind of really compelling work that's possible out of that. Sean, before I sort of ramble on or wrap up rather, I'll say, yeah, please do put any questions, anybody, attendees, put any questions you might have in the chat. We'll have time. I will ensure we have time. So anything you want to ask Tom based on what he's just been kind of outlining, please do put it in there now, and we'll get to them in just a few minutes' time. Yes, the description of it as being a guide in that description that we've got on the screen now. So from Sean Cubitt, Tom Livingstone's Guide to the New Visual Effects. And I think that's a really, it feels like a map where you've kind of pulled out particular points of interest that are really significant and really productive. And then they can be expanded out, they can be traced across to other forms of imaging, other forms of media, in a way that I really look forward to that hopefully happening in the future, whether it's from your own work or other people's work. So one of my own sort of, I won't say bugbears, but like I feel like there are a lot of scholars working on digital visual effects in film and television who don't engage with video games, and I think that's increasingly untenable because we live in such a kind of convergent, overlapping media culture. And if we're talking about certain kinds of digital visual effects, then engaging with kind of media outside of what we might call traditional media of film and TV, so moving into video games, social media, other screen experiences seems really important. And the book, as written, gives us material to then take to those other media. So I was thinking as I read it about how one might say that video games are digital media. They're not hybrid images. They're just digital constructions. It's all made in Unity or Unreal. But that's why kind of the nuanced argument of the book is so helpful, because a hybrid image doesn't necessarily mean there's a bit of a photographic image and a bit of VFX and they meet. You can have the sort of hybrid temporality that you describe in the digital oneer. So even an image which is entirely created in a particular software program is still a hybrid image. And as you said, sort of towards the end of that talk, the images that we encounter from generative AI, and even the text that we encounter from generative AI, is always hybrid, because it's always going to be pulling together multiple, millions of data points into its rendering of what you've asked it to produce. No matter how convincing that image is, no matter how much it fulfills the brief, or how much it might feel like it has distinctive traits, it is always just a hybrid assemblage, albeit kind of a staggeringly complex one, because we're talking about so many data points. But it is always a hybrid image of the kind of existing material that has been fed to that algorithm, which is enormous at this point, and in many cases kind of unquantifiable, unrecordable. We don't know what data sort of a lot of these programs have been trained on, and that gets into kind of issues of authors' rights and kind of the ethics of these sorts of programs. So yeah, I think the book maps the last sort of 10, 15 years of visual effects really effectively, and kind of debates discourses around them, pulls us forward from writing by, say, Leon Gurevich, Leon Gurevich, but also Lev Manovich, Sean Cubitt, Ailish Wood, kind of the sort of material that we have from the 2000s, which is super valuable, but work like this kind of brings it up to date in a way that is really useful, pulls it sort of into the 2020s, and also looks to the future and looks to these kind of ways that we can take this theoretical model and apply it in other places productively. So as I say, I look forward to that happening. I'm going to stop now. I could waffle on for longer. I haven't done the promised takedown. I've just said that it's a great book because it's a great book. So sorry about that. So I'm happy now to turn over to our Q&A box. I see there's something in there.
There is indeed a question from Praveen. Can you see that, Tom?
I'm afraid not. I think it's because I'm in my screen.
You shouldn't look in the chat. You should look in the
Oh, here we
Q
go.
at the bottom. Yeah?
Yeah.
Mm.
Photograph two ways of life. We would ask to delve into the fundamental concept of compositing this work. Rather ghostly. I'm going to have to just Google that while I answer. But perhaps I think just to sort of split my attention here and talk to what Nick was describing about the concept of taking pleasure in these things. That's very much a survival strategy. And as we sort of, it's particularly within the context of an ever more converging media culture, if we and I learned this relatively early in the process, if you just adopt a sort of polemical perspective of, sort of like pointed critique that sort of ultimately renders you slightly superior to your objective critique, then you'll be overwhelmed by the fact that everything speaks to your pessimism. Whereas if you start from a place of like kinesthetic joy and engagement, then there's many more avenues in. And that, I think, also speaks to the work, Mandy, that you and I are sort of doing going forward and thinking about sort of multisensory storytelling and the ways in which bodies are sort of involved and sort of imbricated within media experiences. Were the perspective just to be like, okay, this is a process of discretization. It's all about sort of, exploiting the data exhaust of the body, and it means nothing, and there's no way to find enjoyment within this sort of crushing, commodifying system. Then, to be honest with you, research could only occur in bad faith. And so I think sort of taking pleasure in these things is a sort of like is a fundamental critical survival strategy. I have now done two things at once and Googled two ways of life, which, yes, I think if I'm right, yeah, okay, fantastic. Well, yes. So two ways of life is a sort of is a enormous Victorian composite. It's a very grand widescreen image that is the sort of which is made up of multiple elements, and this I think is very interesting thing to think about, because ultimately the things that we're now very familiar with in terms of image culture, like the compositing together of multiple elements to make a seamless whole, were germane to all sorts of Victorian photographic practices. And this is an example of it. And it's the idea that compositing is an exclusively digital practice is not valid, but that extremely wide historical lens, I think, is very, very valuable, because it also helps us think about the ways in which our critical focus on the sort of accelerating change of contemporary visual media cultures is quite narrow. And so we constantly need to remind ourselves that the sort of anxieties that we're having about generative AI image cultures are ones that are usefully and productively contextualized by the sort of, as exactly what Nick was saying, the relationship between sort of the database architecture of AI models and hybridity as a practice of compositing various data sets. I see the second question from Ricardo. You seem to argue that we've reached a cultural turning point where the uncanny valley doesn't hold anymore. Given the cultural pushback against deepfakes, is there an emergent space for a popularized critique of hybrid images? Well, absolutely. That emergent space is something that I am actively trying to inculcate in this work on visual effects. And again, that speaks to the idea of pleasure being a sort of starting critical perspective, because if critique isn't popular, it's largely useless, or doomed to be marginalized. Let's put it like that. But again, I think deepfakes to build a popular critique of deepfake culture it must proceed through an understanding of technique first, because it's through understanding techniques that one can sort of retain the legibility of the sort of technical process of deepfaking. So again, and I think this is a really sort of interesting critical space on YouTube, those sort of YouTube tutorials as to how to spot a deepfake video call. And it's all to do with, again, relation to camera and the posture of the audience and so on and so forth. And that they have these fantastic sort of breakdowns of the technical criteria of deepfakes that enliven you to the sort of aesthetic characteristics of the experience. And again, keeping those aesthetic characteristics in mind within the envelope of their sort of technical, the technical processes that produce them. is a way of making sure that those insidious practices don't successfully disappear from view. That's a great question, Ricardo. Thank you very much.
So is in a way, is that kind of emergent popularized critique, is in a way, does that respond to the Flusser to the brilliant and really interesting Flusser quote that you gave us about how, how these developments demand a level of consciousness that corresponds to the one in which the images were originally produced? I mean, is that is that how we respond? Is that an answer to Flusser? That there might be practices of media criticism. Do you think where does I'm just kind of wondering where does digital and media literacy in the educational sense fit in as part of the story of kind of making transparent what appear to be a vanishing practices and processes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think this Flusser is a sort of is a provocation that we
Yeah.
sort of keep in mind the sort of social consequences of misreading images, and that the flip side of that is very much a sort of like a demand for greater levels of media literacy. And so, yeah, I think that sort of critical practice of engaging with popular media, especially as it becomes more sort of technically sophisticated and more prevalent, is one means of keeping in view the well, again, deepfakes is such an interesting because the clue is in the name, like of keeping in view those processes that are designed. The illusion is not designed to provide spectacle. The illusion is designed to provide misapprehension, to provoke misapprehension for, and then instrumentalize that misapprehension for various, sort of criminal ends. And yeah, so I think to sort of to make sure that I'm touching both sides of the brackets there, yeah, I think a critical focus on popular culture that elicits a sort of engagement that can sustain a critical practice because it is enjoyable and because you're engaging with it not in bad faith, not because you already know what you're going to say about it, is for me, as my personal sort of intuition, is that is the best sort of bedding for media literacy going forward. And I think there's not enough. YouTube gets a lot of flack, but deserves more credit for its sort of educational, the volume of educational material that's on there, and the sort of wealth of paratexts and so on and so forth, and the VFX breakdowns that again Nick's work engages with in a variety of really interesting ways. But how those just should be said to close out, those are obviously all 2D flat screen pieces of content, and how we update our sort of like this sort of imperative for media literacy to a media context that is increasingly 360 degrees, increasingly sort of addressing other sort of sensory modalities, remains a really interesting question. What does media literacy look like in the sort of the realm of in the era of what did I hit? Oh, internables, yeah, which is the sort of the next level of wearables. So what does media look like in that sort of like when media devices are in fact part of our bodies, and our sort of like our sensory profiles are granularly addressed by technical procedures that evade our apprehension.
Well, that's cool because actually, as you alluded to earlier, that's an area that you're working on now and will be publishing on in due course. So I see it's 7 o'clock and we all need some dinner. So I will move to wrap up by saying thanks to Amy Densley of the Digital Cultures Research Centre, who's been looking after this event behind the scenes. To Nick for coming along and your brilliant comments in response to Tom's book. And congratulations to Tom on a book which I think tangles with some really central, relevant and pressing questions for our time. So, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. The image of the book's still there. It's not too late to take a picture
Oh
of the
my
QR
goodness.
code.
Yeah, so
Order the book, buy the book, or order it from your library and enjoy it. And yeah, so thanks to everyone.
thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.